vagus, and glossopharyngeal nerves, and, like the lateral district, is divisible into a lower and an upper portion. The lower part is limited behind by the posterior median fissure and consists of the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. The fasciculus gracilis is placed parallel to and along the side of the posterior median fissure and separated from the fasciculus cuneatus by the posterior intermediate sulcus and septum. The gracile and cuneate fasciculi are at first vertical in direction, but at the lower part of the rhomboid fossa they diverge from the middle line in a V-shaped manner, and each presents an elongated swelling. That on the fasciculus gracilis is named the clava, and is produced by its subjacent nucleus of gray matter, the nucleus gracilis. That on the fasciculus cuneatus is termed the cuneate tubercle, and is likewise caused by a gray nucleus named the nucleus cuneatus. The fibers of these fasciculi terminate by arborizing around the cells in their respective nuclei. A third elevation, produced by the substantia gelatinosus of Rolando, is present in the lower part of the posterior district of the medulla oblongata. It lies on the lateral aspect of the fasciculus cuneatus and is separated from the surface of the medulla oblongata by a band of nerve fibers which form the spinal tract, spinal root, of the trigeminal nerve. Narrow below, this elevation gradually expands above and ends about 1.25 centimeters below the pons in a tubercle, the tubercle of Rolando, tuber cinereum. The upper part of the posterior district of the medulla oblongata is occupied by the inferior peduncle, a thick rope-like strand situated between the lower part of the fourth ventricle and the roots of the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves. The inferior peduncles connect the medulla spinalis and medulla oblongata with the cerebellum and are sometimes named the restiform bodies. As they pass upward, they diverge from each other and assist in forming the lower part of the lateral boundaries of the fourth ventricle. Higher up, they are directed backwards, each passing to the corresponding cerebellar hemisphere. Near their entrance into the cerebellum, they are crossed by several strands of fibers which run to the median sulcus of the rhomboid fossa and are named the stria medullaris. The inferior peduncle appears to be the upward continuation of the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. This, however, is not so, as the fibers of these fasciculi end in the gracile and cuneate nuclei. The constitution of the inferior peduncle will be subsequently discussed. Caudal to the stria medullaris, the inferior peduncle is partly covered by the corpus pontobulbar, a thin mass of cells and fibers extending from the pons between the origin of the 7th and 8th cranial nerves. Internal structure of the medulla oblongata. Although the external form of the medulla oblongata bears a certain resemblance to that of the upper part of the medulla spinalis, its internal structure differs widely from that of the latter, and this for the following principal reasons. 1. Certain fasciculi, which extend from the medulla spinalis to the brain and vice versa, undergo a rearrangement in their passage through the medulla oblongata. 2. Others, which exist in the medulla spinalis, end in the medulla oblongata. 3. New fasciculi originate in the gray substance of the medulla oblongata and pass to different parts of the brain. 4. The gray substance, which in the medulla spinalis forms a continuous H-shaped column, becomes greatly modified and subdivided in the medulla oblongata, where also new masses of gray substance are added. 5. On account of the opening out of the central canal of the medulla spinalis, certain parts of the gray substance, which in the medulla spinalis were more or less centrally situated, are displaced in the rhomboid fossa. 6. The medulla oblongata is intimately associated with many of the cranial nerves, some arising from and others ending in nuclei within its substance. The cerebrospinal fasciculi. The downward course of these fasciculi from the pyramids of the medulla oblongata and their partial decussation have already been described. In crossing to reach the lateral funiculus of the opposite side, the fibers of the lateral cerebrospinal fasciculi extend backwards through the anterior columns and separate the head of each of these columns from its base. The base retains its position in relation to the ventral aspect of the central canal, and when the latter opens into the fourth ventricle, appears in the rhomboid fossa close to the middle line, where it forms the nuclei of the hypoglossal and abducent nerves, while above the level of the ventricle, it exists as the nuclei of the trochlear and oculomotor nerves in relation to the floor of the cerebral aqueduct. The head of the column is pushed lateralward and forms the nucleus ambiguus, which give origin from below upward to the cranial part of the accessory and the motor fibers of the vagus and glossopharyngeal, and still higher to the motor fibers of the facial and trigeminal nerves. The fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus constitute the posterior sensory fasciculi of the medulla spinalis. They are prolonged upward into the lower part of the medulla oblongata, where they end respectively in the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. These two nuclei are continuous with the central gray substance of the medulla spinalis and may be regarded as dorsal projections of this, each being covered superficially by the fibers of the corresponding fasciculus. On transverse section, the nucleus gracilis appears as a single, more or less quadrangular mass, while the nucleus cuneatus consists of two parts, a larger, somewhat triangular medial nucleus composed of small or medium-sized cells, and a small lateral nucleus containing large cells. The fibers of the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus end by arborizing around the cells of these nuclei. From the cells of the nuclei, new fibers arise. Some of these are continued as the posterior external arcuate fibers into the inferior peduncle and through it to the cerebellum, but most of them pass forward through the neck of the posterior column, thus cutting off its head from its base. Curving forward, they decussate in the middle line with the corresponding fibers of the opposite side and run upward immediately behind the cerebrospinal fibers as a flattened band named the lemniscus or fillet. The decussation of these sensory fibers is situated above that of the motor fibers and is named the decussation of the lemniscus or sensory decussation. The lemniscus is joined by the spinothalamic fasciculus, the fibers of which are derived from the cells of the gray substance of the opposite side of the medulla spinalis. The base of the posterior column at first lies on the dorsal aspect of the central canal, but when the latter opens into the fourth ventricle, it appears in the lateral part of the rhomboid fossa. It forms the terminal nuclei of the sensory fibers of the vagus and glossopharyngeal nerves and is associated with the vestibular part of the acoustic nerve and the sensory root of the facial nerve. Still higher, it forms a mass of pigmented cells, the locus ceruleus, in which some of the sensory fibers of the trigeminal nerve appear to end. The head of the posterior column forms a long nucleus, in which the fibers of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve largely end. The dorso-spinocerebellar fasciculus, fasciculus cerebellospinalis, direct cerebellar tract, leaves the lateral district of the medulla oblongata. Most of its fibers are carried backward into the inferior peduncle of the same side, and through it are conveyed to the cerebellum. But some run upward with the fibers of the lemniscus and, reaching the inferior colliculus, undergo decussation and are carried to the cerebellum through the superior peduncle. The proper fasciculi, basis bundles, of the anterior and lateral funiculi largely consist of intersegmental fibers, which link together the different segments of the medulla spinalis. They assist in the production of the famicula reticularis in the medulla oblongata, and many of them are accumulated into a fasciculus which runs up close to the median raphe between the lemniscus and the rhomboid fossa. This strand is named the medial longitudinal fasciculus and will be again referred to. End of section 8.